Welcome, everyone. I'm delighted you're here. My name is Mark Massa. I'm the director of the Theology Center. And we are delighted to welcome Kate Jackson-Meyer to join us here to talk about her important new book, Tragic Dilemmas in Christian Ethics. Kate is currently a postdoctoral fellow at Harvard's Program in Human Flourishing. I'm going to have to email everybody in my Harvard graduate school cohort to say, Harvard is finally interested in human flourishing. This will actually come as a big surprise. Kate received her PhD in theological ethics here at Boston College in 2018. Kate's research interests include bioethics and medical ethics, fundamental moral theology, feminist and gender ethics, political ethics, and virtue ethics. Please join me in welcoming Kate this afternoon.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you to the Bosby Center, especially Father Massa and Susan and Zach for organizing. I really appreciate it. This book is a project that came out of my dissertation work that I did here at Boston College, so it means a lot to be able to be here back in my intellectual home, especially seeing faculty that were very important to my development, especially Professor Ruccini. Thank you, and it's wonderful to see former students that I had when I was teaching in the Faith, Peace, and Justice minor. Thank you for being here, and great to see these new faces as well. I'm very much looking forward to our conversation. So what I'll do is, by way of introduction, I want to make two general points, one about what a dilemma is, kind of just broadly to see what I'm thinking about here, and then to let you know how I see my work within the larger landscape of theological ethics. After that, I'll kind of get into the meat of the presentation, which is to tell you about the book, my contention that Christian ethics ought to take up this category of tragic dilemmas, and what I think that category should look like. Please feel free to ask questions along the way. I will try and keep the remarks around 15 to 20 minutes to have time for conversation afterwards, because that is the most exciting part, hearing from you. I really want to hear what you have to say. I'm interested in your thoughts, and I'm very grateful for all of you for being here. So to get started, just a kind of brief thought on dilemmas. So in a dilemma, one ought to do A and one ought to do B, but one can't do both. And a tragic dilemma is a dilemma that involves tragedy of some sort. Dilemmas are generally debated in philosophy and usually discounted in theology, because what kind of good God would put us in a situation where we can't make our right choice? But I think that it's not God that puts us in those situations as much as it is sin. Sinful actions, sinful social structures, we find ourselves in these kinds of situations. It's important to acknowledge this category as well, because of the response that we need to have as a Christian community, which I will also address. And so just briefly kind of where I see this within the landscape of theological ethics. I see my work in general, and this book specifically, at the intersection of fundamental moral theology and social Catholic ethics. So in fundamental moral theology, we think about issues such as sin and love and virtue and authority and law and grace and right action, right? So fundamental theology is going to have, moral theology is going to help us think about how to make a right choice when we're facing these obligations to do A or to do B. And Catholic social ethics teaches us about sinful social structures and relationships. And I think that bringing the insights of Catholic social ethics to bear on fundamental moral theology will give us some new insights into decision making. So while traditionally fundamental moral theology has led us to really focus on individual actors and individual actions at discrete moments in time, Catholic social ethics wants us to look at these broader relationships. And so when we take those insights into discrete actions, I think we can see the way in which everyday actions are complicated by the web of relationships that we're in and the social structures that we find ourselves embedded in. And I see this work as drawing on and building on insights from others, especially at BC, that have done work on social structures Dan Daly, Andrea Vicini, Lisa Cahill, Kristen Heyer, but really then specifically seeing how this notion of tragic dilemmas and constrained situations is offering something new. All right, so now to kind of get into the book itself, you have a handout there. And so what I want to do to start is to look at 3 cases. And before I get you on board with the category of tragic dilemmas, I want to first make the case that our current strategies for solving hard cases are insufficient. So you'll see on the handout these 3 different cases. I'm going to start with the first one, which is adapted from the film Eye in the Sky. And if you were in my class, we made a lot of this film and the ethics involved, so maybe you have some additional insights as you've been percolating on that now for a while. So in this case, armed forces are working together from different countries to figure out what to do a drone strike in order to stop terrorists who are plotting a terrorist attack in a compound, and so they're figuring out what to do. And then as they're working this out, they see that there's a little girl outside of the compound selling bread, and so it's almost certain that this little girl will die as a result of the strike. And so generally, this is solved in a few ways. So just the compound, hitting the compound itself. We have traditional just war theory, right authority, right intention, just cause. My students can list them off, right? Reasonable success, last resort, things like that, right? To understand that, we have use in bello criteria that are going to help us understand to discriminate between combatants and non-combatants to make that action. And then the particular notion of the girl that we're going to have this loss of life is usually covered under what's known as the principle of double effect, which comes from Aquinas' thought in the Summa, where he's discussing killing, the morality of killing in self-defense, and it evolved from there. It's not exactly like that, but and so the principle of double effect is one of the various strategies that are used to solve hard cases, and I talk about quite a few strategies in the book. I'm only focusing on a couple today, but this is an important one, and I've written it down for you here at the bottom of the handout, the parts of the principle of double effect. I'm just going to spend a little time just so that to make this point. So according to the principle of double effect, actions are permissible as long as they adhere to the following. The act is good or neutral, so we're going to understand the drone strike, according to these things I've already said, is a neutral action. The evil is unintended. That's very clear, right? Nobody wants this girl to die. The evil effect is not the means of attaining the good, right? It's not because of this girl's death that we're going to bomb the compound. It could be done another way. And the good effect is proportionate to the evil cause. So in this case, it's the loss of the life of the girl, which is very unfortunate, but we're going to be saving a lot of people that would have died if the bomb went off, in a busy marketplace or whatever it is. And you see in the film, but you see this in other places as well, even though we have this criteria and it seems to, we check all the boxes, that the moral actors have some kind of problem with it. Not everybody, but some people. There's a little bit of hesitation to go through with this, a kind of question mark about whether or not that this action really is justified. And you especially see that in the field of moral injury. So that's a body of research coming out of psychology that's looking at veterans coming back from war, and they're experiencing a kind of mental harm that's not properly described by something like PTSD. And moral injury covers a whole host of actions, so it's a complicated body of literature, but you certainly see in there veterans coming back who know about just war theory, and they know about the principle of double effect, and they're trained killers, and they're coming back and they're saying, I did these things, whatever it is, a drone strike or whatever, and it doesn't actually feel as right as I was led to believe it was going to. And I think that's an important insight, and I want to take that really seriously, and that is really what the book is trying to do, to say that these people are coming back, these examples and other examples, and saying, these strategies that we have, they're not really explaining my moral experience. And what good is ethics if it's not explaining moral experience? And so I'm making a case for tragic dilemmas in light of that insight, not because of their experience, right? It's not because somebody came back from war and they felt like it was wrong. That doesn't make it wrong. But I think it's an important insight, and that's what really leads me to do this investigation and to think about ways that our ethics might need to be updated by introducing this new category. My suspicion is that something like the principle of double effect is welcome because it allows us to look at these situations and pretend that these cases are solved as a society without really acknowledging our own involvement in them. So to say as if, the cases in war, these ethical hard cases, they're kind of hermetically sealed, principle of double effect, just war, they solved them, everything's okay. When really, when we're looking at this, again, zooming out with the insights from Catholic social ethics to say, no, this is much more complicated than that. We can't just say this is justified in some sort of way. It's actually much more complex than that. The other examples I'm not going to go into as much detail. You can read them there on the handout. I just want to make a point here. In the second example, it's talking about a bioethics case, the case of Mr. C. So a young man who's on a ventilator after getting hit in a car accident, and this is in the Philippines. The parents are using all of their money now to support Mr. C on the ventilator. They can't support his brothers and sisters. In light of this, Mr. C wants to be taken off the ventilator. The mother faces a hard decision. In bioethics, this is solved by many ways. Lisa Cahill takes up this case in her theological bioethics book. She says, double effect is one of the ways to solve this. And you use double effect and you're ignoring the mother saying this is a really hard decision. And Lisa herself, when looking at this, says, that we're using double effect to essentially get us off the hook here, to ignore the social factors, especially when you see something in bioethics, thinking about healthcare inequities, this family, Mr. C, the children, somebody else in different circumstances wouldn't have to face this hard choice. Is it really fair to say, well, double effect is going to solve it, and the rest of us are not implicated? I think it's far more complicated than that. The other case is from resource allocation and the pandemic. Various strategies were going around to solve that. Catholic social ethics, Catholic healthcare ethics, utilitarian, whatever the mode is. The presumption is, so you have one ventilator, patient A needs it, patient B needs it, who's going to get it. The assumption with these very fine models of, how to decide who gets the ventilator, the assumption is, well, you have one ventilator, and as long as you do the best you can and you make the best decision, then that's okay. And that is understood as this principle of odd implies can. You're only morally obligated to do the things that you can do, and if you can't do it, you can't give both of the people the ventilator, then you're not morally responsible for doing that. And you see in different articles about the pandemic, healthcare workers really suffering, feeling the weight of that decision. And it leaves us to wonder, is that really the case? And so when you look at these kinds of cases, you see what we have are these conflict of obligations. Saving the girl, saving the innocent people who will die by the terrorist attack. Saving Mr. C, taking care of his brothers and sisters. Saving patient A, saving patient B. And so what I wanted to do then is investigate, the nature of obligations. And moral philosophy has done a lot with that. Bernard Williams, coming from moral philosophy, wrote what is the foundational paper in the dilemmas literature in philosophy, where he questions this notion of obligation. And he says, you're thinking about we are thinking about obligations in this way where they can just fall away, right? They can dissolve. You make the best choice, and the obligation not chosen for can dissolve. And he says, well, that's not really the case. What we're doing is thinking about it as if obligations operate like beliefs, when really they operate like desires. And so he says, if we have two beliefs that conflict, You're going to rewrite your beliefs, and then the one that doesn't work, you're not going to have anymore, right? So if I believe all theologians are friendly, and I believe the grumpy person that I met in the parking lot is a theologian, now I have to rethink my beliefs. Right now, both of those are true. I rethink it. Oh, that person was, whatever, right? In the philosophy department. No, just kidding.
Always good to blame the philosopher.
Yeah. And so I rewrite my beliefs. But desires aren't like that, right? So Williams gives the example of a man who wants to marry Joan and he wants to marry Susan. He doesn't want to marry Joan and Susan. And when he marries Joan, just following this example more, right, that desire to marry Susan doesn't just go away, right? It remains in this kind of way. And so Williams says that's the case with obligations. And he calls it this regret or a remainder. It's this remaining part. And then the dilemmas literature just goes from there, thinking about this. He kind of leaves it vague in some ways. And there are two philosophers that take this up that I've been greatly influenced by that I'll just mention. So one is Rosalind Hursthouse, who looks at this specifically in terms of tragic dilemmas. And one point to note is that I'm making a big thing of tragic dilemmas, right? But it's not necessarily in the literature that every philosopher that looks at dilemmas is going to hold this distinction. And in fact, I think that's where there's a lot of confusion in the literature. So that's one of, I hope, my contributions here is to really home in on one kind of thing, a tragic dilemma. But she says, agents that act in tragic dilemmas, they do something that's essentially not good. They kill somebody, they tell a lie, and they can't leave that without their life being marred in some way, this kind of leftover, this marring, and I think that's really important. And Lisa Tessman in the field of philosophy looks at this literature, and she comes up with this distinction between negotiable obligations and non-negotiable obligations. So negotiable ones these are the ones that can fall away and dissolve when you make the right choice. But non-negotiables, those are special. Those perdure. Those last no matter what. And she supports it using a constructivist view, which is not my framework, but I think that we can find non-negotiable obligations in Christian thought based on our commitment to protect human life and to protect human vulnerability. And when we start to see that, then you see these cases here. They're about these non-negotiable obligations that are in conflict, right? The life of the innocent people and the life of the girl, the siblings and Mr. C, the different people in the ventilator. These are non-negotiable obligations. That is why we start hearing, in my view, people coming back and saying, yeah, that wasn't as right as I thought. And so I think when these are at stake, we are morally responsible for this obligation that was not chosen for. And I understand that moral responsibility in a variety of ways, both individually and socially. So individually, using a relational autonomy that comes from feminist thought. So because we are relational, we are obligated to people in different ways. And I'm expanding moral responsibility here in a way feminists normally wouldn't. But to see that as the basis of this. And also social responsibility. So because these events are often a result of structural sin and our embeddedness in them, there's a kind of social responsibility as well. And I see that understood within Catholic social thought's understanding of structures of injustice and Dan Finn thinking about emergence. But also, I think that there's a call here for this response of the Christian community, a very concrete call, not to kind of think very vaguely about our moral responsibility, but to really say we as a Christian community, we have people in our community who were at war, who are facing these situations. It's our responsibility to respond. It's also our responsibility to think about in very concrete ways how our actions are somehow involved in that. And I think that kind of communal reflection will make some kind of insights appear as to how we are really responsible. Thinking of a church, meditating on its implication in healthcare policies and healthcare injustice, and to come up with kind of very concrete things in light of very particular reflections in each community. I take these concerns to Augustine and Aquinas. And while they would not argue for a category of tragic dilemmas, I do think that there's a lot more place in their thought for complexity in hard cases than they're normally given credit for. And that's something that we can get into a little bit more in the questions if that's of interest to you. I will read briefly in a moment kind of my definition of tragic dilemmas and locate to you where I find Augustine and Aquinas helpful in my overall understanding. So within all of this, then to say this, to go back to that healing part, so we have a tragic dilemma. It's important for the Christian community to respond. In the last chapter of the book, I address these different ways that the Christian community should respond, both in this personal or communal reflection about social responsibility, but also then how do you create inroads for people in your community that have been in these situations to come back into the community, practices that develop that. And I think that looking at tragedy can be very hard, and especially expanding moral responsibility. But I think precisely because we're Christians and we have a belief in redemption, that we have the ability to look deeply into tragedy, to acknowledge it, to acknowledge the hard places, to acknowledge wrongdoing in times when maybe we haven't before. And we can do that because we have great faith in forgiveness and in redemption, and I think that that's important. So by closing, I will just read here my central claim, which is at the top of your handout, and then I will open it up to questions. So in a tragic dilemma, a moral agent chooses between with sufficient knowledge, so coming from Aquinas of how to think about what is sufficient knowledge really know, or some that a consequence is foreseeable. Conflicting non-negotiable moral obligations rooted in Christian commitments to protect human life and the vulnerable, and recognized by Augustinian lament. I think Augustine can help us think about negotiable and non-negotiable obligations, and lament is a way that we can do that, and something we can talk about more if you're interested. And transgressing a non-negotiable obligation involves wrongdoing that causes great harm and may mar an agent's life in accordance with Hursthouse, but personal culpability is mitigated so long as the agent acts with Thomistic repugnance of the will. This is a place in Aquinas that happy to talk about more at the questions if you're interested, where I think he does a lot with very complex situations. He talks about acting with repugnance of the will, so doing something that you'd rather not do, but in the circumstances it's the right thing. And that notion of repugnance of the will, I think, can alert us, wow, we're transgressing a non-negotiable moral obligation. We're doing it in the most moral way possible, however, and that's important to mitigate our moral responsibility. And societal culpability is operative when the tragic dilemma is a result of structural sin. In response, Christian communities should offer individual and communal healing after tragic dilemmas. So that is the thesis of the book, and I would love to open it up to you for questions, comments, thoughts. So,
okay, I have a question about the eye in the sky case.
Yes.
Traditional Catholic ethics, that is Thomistic ethics, condemns the use of proportionalism. And proportionalism is the argument that it's better to let moral harm fall on one person if you're going to save a lot more. So proportionally, that's the justification. Traditionally, Catholic ethics has condemned proportionalism as not a stance, it's an option. Do you consider that, and you consider the traditional Catholic condemnation of proportionalism in talking about that case?
So in that particular case, I mean, proportionality comes up insofar as we understand it within double effect, so not in and of itself justifying the action, just something to be aware of. I don't take it up within Catholic thought, but certainly because I'm dealing with moral philosophy, I look at utilitarianism, and so I think, like, by way of that, to look at thinking about when we're trying to say that, so in utilitarianism, you're in a maximizing utilitarianism, you want to do the greatest thing for the greatest number, and I take up critiques of that mode specifically through Martha Nussbaum, who says, when we do something like that, or a cost-benefit analysis, which she kind of distinguishes between different types of utilitarian accounting, what we miss is the tragedy in the case. And so by that way, it encounters that only to say when you're just kind of looking at what's going to be the best option by number of utils or proportions or whatever, there's this sense of tragedy that Nussbaum says we miss that. And her suggestion is to say never allow that. And she gives certain examples of how you just say no. Once you recognize the tragedy that will come about, you essentially say no, and you need to find alternative solutions.
So we need more Niebuhr in our Murray.
Yeah.
Good. How is it then that you identify the non-negotiables when everything of moral import can be described and redescribed so frequently? So, like, I'm thinking maybe an abusive partner. You have obligations to your sacred vows if you're married to that person, say, or a commitment to that person's welfare, but also you're in a destructive relationship. Or in the just war situation, an obligation to protect the innocent also corresponds to a decision to enhance your national power. Or things can be described and redescribed, and in virtue theory, you can talk about this in many different ways. Things can become something else. How do you wrestle with that in the book or in your project?
Great, thank you. So one point that I think that brings up just in general, and then to answer your question, is one reason why I like Testman's distinction between negotiable and non-negotiable obligations is if you don't have it, everything's a moral dilemma, and then you can't make any decision. And so I think she's right to say not all obligations can fall away, but some can, and now let's start to think about which ones are non-negotiable. And so I'm saying that these not, and then from that I'm saying in the Christian view, the only kind of situation that can be called a dilemma is one that involves a non-negotiable. So by default, the only view of dilemmas that is plausible within Christian thought is a tragic dilemma. So I don't want to say that within Christianity we can, we suddenly can't make any choices or have a hard time with that. So, I think that the distinction is important. I agree that it may be hard at times to determine what exactly are non-negotiables and what are not. And this is a challenge that also, Testman has to face as well. But I do think that it's worth trying to settle on a distinction. So some of the ways that I think we can find that are, firstly, just primarily in what they're rooted in quite, I think, extreme things, human life and human vulnerability. So I'm not sure, in my view, that a marriage promise is necessarily going to constitute that. And I think there are probably plenty of ways of thinking about the marriage within within Catholic thought that would, say, okay, you should not be in an abusive marriage. Maybe there are certainly reasons for annulment if the marriage was abusive, right? So I would be more inclined to go down that kind of road for that kind of situation. But for particularly understanding when these non-negotiables rooted in human life and human dignity appear, I think that one way is we can turn to Augustine, which will only help us reflect a little bit more. Maybe we reflect communally to think about it more. I'm not sure that there's a bright line necessarily. But since you brought up Niebuhr, and it has this connection to Augustine, I will tell you my views on Augustine on this, which is to say, I think that in Augustine you can find this distinction between negotiable and non-negotiable dilemmas, or obligations, excuse me. So he talks about the wise judge, right? My students know that one, right? So the wise judge has to torture in order to find out the truth. And Augustine says, well, this judge we're going to know that it's a good, wise judge because the judge will say, deliver me from my necessities, right? The judge will feel this decision really in a really hard, harsh way. That's how we're going to know it's a wise judge. But the judge, Augustine says, is both guiltless, right? If you were in my class, I made like a huge thing of this, right? Augustine says the judge is guiltless, so the judge does nothing wrong, but the judge is not happy, right? And the judge is saying, deliver me from my necessities. Some people have just called that a dilemma. Lisa called it a dilemma. Cavadini has called it a dilemma. I'm not. It depends how you think of dilemma. One thing we didn't get into in the literature is like how you think about guilt. No consensus, but you can see there that I'm going to call that lament. The judge has great lament over this not upholding this obligation. War, right? Augustine laments war. So this great lament of having to go to war. Other things, interestingly, Augustine doesn't lament. So if you can't bury the dead, so you need to bury the dead, but your town is sieged and you can't go back and bury the dead, Augustine is like, oh yeah, well, that happens. That's okay, essentially. Which would have been at the time like a very countercultural idea, right? That's a big deal. But he doesn't have that sense of lament there. And so I think that's very interesting. And again, with my criteria, I don't think that fall. Go ahead.
But can killing someone ever be a non-negotiable obligation?
Never not be.
Can it ever be a non-negotiable obligation?
That you need to
kill somebody. So the drone case is presented as a dilemma where you must launch this drone to save others in the future. You're killing someone and you might kill the girl with the bread, right? But is in your argument, can killing ever be a part of a non-negotiable obligation? Or is it the relationality that you're protecting through killing that is the non-negotiable obligation?
It certainly might still be the right thing to do,
Mm-hmm.
the best thing to do, but I still think, in terms of it's the best thing to do, but I still think you're morally responsible for it because it's non-negotiable.
Mm-hmm.
Not that so it doesn't necessarily need to be the case that because we have this category of tragic dilemmas that anything actually changes in the drone case, right? They may well have done the best thing possible by killing the girl. What I'm concerned with is our lack of moral responsibility, both with the actors and socially, that I think we need to pick up on. We could, there's certainly also within Catholic healthcare kind of distinctions that we could think about too.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
Thanks very much, Kate. That was really enlightening, so great to hear more about your book. And I just had a question concerning the thesis that you presented, the central claim that you presented, because I was just thinking that a critic might push back and say, well, no, like in these sort of tragic situations, there is ultimately one obligation that prevails over the other, or there's a right way to act, a single right way to act, or something like that, and so you should do that, and you may feel regret, but the regret is more at the, if you will, like the terrible state of our world, given sin as such, rather than the way that you've acted. And I know, kind of pick up on the Bernard Williams literature, like he's got that integrity objection to utilitarianism, where he talks about how utilitarianism, if you really followed it to its radical conclusions, it could effectively take away your ability to maintain commitments as an agent, like moral commitments to non-negotiable obligations, because in theory utilitarianism can get you to do anything if the good that you're going to realise is great enough. So I was just kind of thinking, what I suppose there's these two ways you can go on the tragic dilemma sort of idea. You can go your way and you can go the sort of other way. Like, why overall did you go the way you did? Like, because I imagine that was sort of a bit of a thought process when writing the book. I'm just keen to hear that. Yeah.
Great, thank you. I think my main contention is that the non-negotiable obligation still remains. That I just see that. I don't see any way out of that, and I'm not convinced by theories that claim that it remains. It doesn't mean that you can't make the right choice or a best choice. It's a better way of saying it. I'm sorry, a best choice. You can certainly, and the virtuous person will, figure out the best course of action, and you still need to do that. But the obligation perdures. The non-negotiable obligation perdures. I don't see how we can really say that it doesn't, especially because of our obligations to others. You see that like much more in a case like Mr. C. This mother now lives with this for the rest of her life. That was her son. That was the decision she makes. She still feels that obligation. No matter what ethical strategy we come up with, that relationship entails obligations. And so that's the part that I'm just not convinced by those strategies. Another case that I use in the book that I didn't talk about here is Sophie's choice. Right, so the Nazis put Sophie in a situation where she has to decide to save one of her two children. And Lisa Tessman takes up this case, and her point is, when we kind of read Sophie's choice and this with figuring out what the right thing to do was, we miss what Tessman says is the entire point of the book, which is that Sophie lives with this hard decision for the rest of her life, and it takes over and informs the rest of her life. And so there's this tragedy that's a moral tragedy that is lost when we say that somehow that obligation dissolves, it doesn't remain anymore. And so I find that very convincing. I find cases of veterans coming back from war saying, yeah, you know what, you told me the obligation, I could make a right choice and the obligation would dissolve, but it didn't. I still feel responsible. And so that's not the basis of the argument, but I see that that's why I went in this direction, to say I see moral experience teaching us something about obligations that is lost when we claim that the non-negotiables are somehow upheld in some kind of way.
So just to ask, how does that play into then, confessions of sin or feelings of guilt? If you live with the feeling of having been able to have done something else, but you had to make one of two choices, you did not do something right, and you live with it, but at the same time you might be morally clean. I'm just curious, I'm not sure what my question is. I'm just fascinated by this.
Yeah. So I think it's a couple of things. Like when you look at the moral injury literature, which is again not coming out of ethics, the ethical categories are vague and a mess in my opinion, but you see that real people, real psychologists who are looking at veterans coming back from war, some of them did very nefarious things, others didn't. They followed everything that they should have done. That what moral injury tends to say, what the literature tends to say is, forgiveness. You should forgive yourself. It's so interesting. They you don't need forgiveness unless you're morally responsible for something. And so I think we ought to just say it. That you are morally culpable. I think we should just name this. I think pretending that it's something else, that then you can't heal if you don't just say you're morally responsible. There's moral responsibility, and we can do that. We're Christian. We believe in forgiveness and redemption. We can say, yes, yeah, you did the best thing possible. That was a horrible situation, and there was really no right thing. You don't get out morally unscathed. There is moral culpability. Praise be to God that we're Christians because we have forgiveness. I see that as a much better and more authentic way forward.
This is a finger on that one. Just sorry. Feel free to just move on to the next question. But I was just kind of a little more of a push just there. But that was really helpful already. But just, could you say it's a terrible situation, but you're not morally responsible? Like are there other explanatory ways of other explanations for the kind of phenomena that you're trying to explain? because I'd sort of want to have both if I could. But you don't. I mean,
I
obviously,
don't,
you
yeah. Yeah, I mean, yeah, well, you say, well, you know, these are the strategies. There are other strategies about why you're not morally responsible. And again, I think that gets the individuals off the hook who don't necessarily want to be off the hook. They just want to have somebody describe the thing that they're looking at. It gets society off the hook when we definitely shouldn't be off the hook. You know, we should all be, you know, when you see a case like Mr. C and the kind of way that structural injustices cause this kind of thing in healthcare inequity, we should all be feeling really badly about that. I just struggle with the way these strategies, you know, they pretend it's solved when they're really not. And so those strategies are the ways to say you're not morally responsible. And I don't think that really captures what's going on.
Kate, could you, following this conversation, thank you very much for your presentation, could you clarify what you indicated as a sort of provision in the way you describe what concerns personal culpability? You indicated is mitigated so long as the agent acts with Thomistic repugnance on the will. But thinking of the case you presented in others, you might say that I might have a very confused understanding of what my will was, you know, because there was a pressure that, you know, I was facing in that context. And so I might have mixed wills, I could say. And so how can I rely on this condition in this very delicate area where I feel I'm culpable and it is important for my healing process and for, you know, somehow healing my moral will, when I have doubt on my moral will, and that cannot help me to, you know, move forward from the consequences of the tragic dilemma that I addressed. So, you know, it seems that the condition is undermining the possibility of what you're indicating. How can you help me to clarify that condition? Because you could say, maybe we don't need repugnance of the will, according to Aquinas, because we have a messy will, and then there is a mix of, you know, desires or intentions or wills at that moment, and so that is not going to help me because I cannot sort it out, as I cannot sort out the fact that I had to do something that I would have preferred to avoid doing.
Great, thank you for the question. So there are a couple of things. The first is that and it also kind of relates to what Eric asked. I mean, I understand the category and the negotiables and non-negotiables and what they're based in. And my goal is to bring this category, but then to encourage rigorous personal and communal reflection in order to figure out, you know, whether you yourself have faced a tragic dilemma. And so part of what you're talking about, I hope, would be done in these communal practices, this communal practice of addressing tragic dilemmas in these various ways that I talk about at the end of the book in the last chapter. So one of those is a more rigorous ethical reflection. So Jim Keenan wrote about this idea of a soul friend from the Irish penitentials, where you have a person, a confessor, and a priest, and they talk about your ethical obligations as a soul friend. I mean, the phrase itself, it's so beautiful, right? You can imagine it's a relationship, a soul friend, somebody who's helping you to think about your relationship with God and your ethical action. So I think part of it is that, encouraging much more reflection on ethics, having more resources available, doing that in community, that kind of thing, so that when a person has in a kind of situation like that and they have a sense of mixed wills, it's just kind of getting the ethics more out on the table, being more intentional about the way that we help each other reflect ethically. So that's one piece of it. The other piece is that what I was trying to avoid is to say, now that we have a category of tragic dilemmas, I'm not trying to help people to justify bad things because it was a dilemma. So I was trying to say, you know, exactly like Augustine's judge, although repugnance of the will is coming from Aquinas, we know the wise judge because he laments this. You know, he bemoans, God, deliver me from my necessity. So repugnance of the will is that kind of ding, ding, ding. You're not the drone pilot that shoots without thinking. You're the one that you pause, like in the movie. You're thinking. You take this very seriously. So it was more at that angle that I was going at, and also because I'm trying to expand moral responsibility in cases where we normally wouldn't, so to also like limit that in some way. I have great appreciation for people who very thoughtfully are faced with these situations, and so to acknowledge that in their own moral thought. But I certainly agree it's complicated, but I hope the community can be there to help.
I have a question. In the case of Mr. C, is it more of a tragedy that the family couldn't afford to pay to keep him alive, or is it about his quality of life, or is it both?
Thanks. Yeah. In the case that it comes from the bioethics book, it was more about not being able to pay for the ventilator. That was the primary problem. So you get the sense from the case that had they had enough money for the ventilator, and then I'm expanding the case a little bit. But if you had, imagine, like that. But if you had a case where, it was that in a different circumstance, if you had the money, of course you'd be keeping Mr. C alive. But what's preventing that is the lack of funds, and that Mr. C sees that as well, and so that's why he asked the mother, just take me off of this because I don't want to see my brothers and sisters like that. Did you have a follow-up?
No, I'm just
Okay.
Digesting.
Okay.
I had a question. Did you look at all into almost like the opposite decision, like people or groups choosing like the wrong decision in accordance to like the principle of double effect and things like that, and maybe how like that type of a moral conscience and dilemma might, I don't know, expand?
Yeah, that's very interesting. I'm trying to introduce this category to say, you're making the best decision possible, and to complicate our moral responsibility. If you're in that case and you're not making the best decision possible, maybe you found yourself in a tragic dilemma, and instead of having your moral culpability mitigated, you actually just act wrongly, right? And so that's just something that's wrong. And that's a separate issue. I'm looking at times where we would usually say that's right, and I think it's maybe a little bit more complicated. But certainly, to your point, it's not meant to kind of just allow, because there's a dilemma, it doesn't mean that you can do anything. There's still a wrong action, and there's the best choice possible action as well.
What would you say to people who say people should have to make these decisions? It's not up to government to provide health care so that Mr. C's family doesn't even have to think about this. This should be a personal decision. It should not be kicked up to a social justice issue. I'm just wondering how you would respond.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I think that by not having the category, we really allow for that kind of rhetoric. One of the points I make when thinking about social responsibility is the notion of culture, and just the way that our ideas are embedded in culture, and the way that we support culture. And I think that not having the category at all supports a culture where these decisions are made and then we can ignore them and ignore the reality of Mr. C and his family. So I think introducing the category in and of itself is making a kind of case for why certain policies are important, because without them you can see that individuals suffer. They suffer physically in many cases, but also morally. And I want to name that kind of moral suffering, moral harm.
After writing the book, did you see that you could apply that in concrete context, or did you have the chance to show that what you are proposing can have helpful, practical, concrete implications in some particular context.
Thanks. Well, I certainly think when the book was like a project and then coronavirus happened, and then I thought, wow, suddenly I have something that I know about that seems to speak to the moment that we're in. And that, was a great drive to get this out and get it out in the world to say, this seems to be speaking to the moment, that especially with ventilator allocation, which seemed very important early on in the pandemic, and the different strategies. It's really nice to say that we can make a best choice, and we really admire healthcare workers and what they were going through, and there's different kind of levels of decision making involved. But in reality, when I was reading the newspaper, I'm seeing, I have a quote in the book and in my notes from Dr. Saeed in Boston, who's saying, every time we make this decision, a part of our soul gets chipped away, and I think that this category is speaking to what I'm reading in the newspaper, when I'm reading in magazines, and so that was a great drive to pursue this. My related interest is on moral distress, which is facing healthcare workers as well. And moral distress comes out of the field of nursing, to talk about nurses who wanted to do the right course of action but were limited by institutional constraints. And in the original literature from Jameson, that specifically is not a dilemma. So I see this kind of my body of research speaking to the kinds of decisions that are happening right now on the ground, especially in healthcare. And I think that bringing these categories, introducing tragic dilemmas, thinking about moral distress, thinking about how it relates to dilemmas or not, is really speaking to a need. And next spring, I am organizing a workshop through an ILA grant here at BC with some professors in the nursing school on moral distress for healthcare, for nursing students and chaplains. And so that'll be a place where we can really talk about these ideas.
Following with that, my question is connected with this, do you see, now talking about reality, do you see this increasing or decreasing, the dilemmas, the lament following that? Because someone could say that we are living in a more permissive or more unproblematic societies. Do you see that, or do you see the opposite? That is more necessary, a book like yours, because we are living in a more in a society that feels the distress coming from tragic elements more clearly.
Thank you. Yeah, I think living in a global society, we're seeing our web of relationships increase in an increasingly complex way. So I see this as a more pressing issue. The more that I understand where, my sweater was made and who was involved in making it, the more complicated ethics becomes, as it should. And it might seem then overwhelming once you start to kind of think about all of the ways that the decisions that we make are have some kind of problematic part. But I think that it's really important to acknowledge that. And I think that the more we see each other, the more we see other societies, the more we see how our decisions impact other people, the more tragic dilemmas becomes a more real and pressing concern.
Could you speak? My inclination, just in light of cultural violence and other constraints on human agency, my inclination is always to offload culpability onto society, almost always. Is it the case? Is there research, or is there even illustrations? This maybe repeating what Father Bacini asked you, but are there illustrations or any research that show that bringing back the responsibility to the particular agent does alleviate that guilt in actuality, or is it still a sort of perspective of hope that it will do so, that we're addressing something that's...
Thank you. I mean, I see that emerging within the moral injury literature, where they're using forgiveness as this catch-all for a whole bunch of different actions in war. some of which are nefarious, others of which absolutely are not. And there's no sense in the moral injury literature to map forgiveness onto a particular kind of event. And the insight of moral injury, I think, is to say, wow, these soldiers were coming back, they feel bad, like let's acknowledge that, let's name that. That was a great insight. And they use this term forgiveness too fluidly, in my opinion, but or at least not precisely, but they use it, and I think that's a sign. If you look at any of the most of the moral injury healing literature, forgiveness is one of the steps. So Brett Litz wrote this important article with others on that and on moral injury, and he has a book, Adaptive Exposure, one of the healing processes. This is about forgiveness. It's not really the literature itself, because it's not in ethics, is not pinpointing exactly what you're saying, And when I was doing the dissertation research, I did speak with psychologists who work in moral injury, because my sense was that they're using forgiveness without exactly identifying the moral issue, which was correct in my conversations with them. But they find it to be incredibly effective, right, using forgiveness. And so I think we could probably stretch that out a little and just name, why do you need to be forgiven? Because you're morally responsible. I think it's the assumption there, but not exactly named. And you see that throughout. My students watched a documentary about moral injury, Almost Sunrise. And when there's these two veterans suffering from their actions that they did in war, some were absolutely within just war bounds, others seem to not be. But one of the great moments in this documentary is when one of the men meets with a priest who says, you're forgiven, and that's really powerful, and you see that in the documentary. It's really palpable. And so I see that as a way where we can really boost that. We have a whole theoretical framework to understand through the dilemma literature, why you might need forgiveness, and then to say just owning that incident or whatever incidents, that then was the pathway towards healing.
One more question.
Sorry. So I'm thinking back to the eye on the sky example, and this is a military context in which there are levels of power and hierarchy. And I'm curious, how much agency the agent has to have, because maybe I saw the movie, but it's been a while. But in the back of the mind it was the guy, right? Mm-hmm. I can't remember if he had a family or not, but you have to be wondering in the back of his mind, what are his obligations to his family if he doesn't follow through with the order that has been given? So, how much agency does the person have to be able to be a moral agent in a situation?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's so interesting that it's hardly addressed in the dilemmas literature, even though it seems so critical. So Lisa Tessman makes a distinction between absent morality and dilemmatic morality. So absent morality is when you can't, there's nothing in it to make an immoral choice. The example she gives is from the Holocaust. Somebody named Abraham P. He's in one of the lines for the concentration camps, and there are two lines. It's him and his brothers, and he thinks the other line will be better. He tells him to go to the other line. It turns out that line's going to the gas chamber. He lives with this guilt for the rest of his life. And he feels that. He looks back, and he sees agency that Tessman and others say, you didn't have agency. You had no idea what was happening here. There's no way to make that choice. That wasn't a moral choice. You did not have agency. That's absent morality. And then there's this dilemmatic morality where you have some kind of agency. And Tessman says, it's difficult, looking at Sophie, it's difficult to say how exactly Sophie has more agency than Abraham P., but I think he does have some more. She has some more agency than him. There's something, but she doesn't exactly explore why that is. I think that part of it has to do with knowledge. and so I look to Aquinas for that. So knowing the foreseeable action, knowing the consequences of your action to some kind of extent. So there we can kind of understand Abraham, he had no idea what was going to happen. Sophie can see what's going to happen when she makes a choice, and that kind of knowledge, having a sense of what's foreseeable, what's very likely, introduces at least one element of agency. Certainly in a situation like in the armed forces, your agency is very constrained, but even, the drone pilot, at the end of the day, it is his call to pull the trigger. And that does come out in the movie, and he does push back a bit. And he says to wait. And there I see that, he's acting with repugnance of the will. He does not want to pull the trigger. He would really rather not. He's going to stop. He's going to ask them to reevaluate. He wants to give the girl more time. Those are all of the kinds of things that agents acting with the repugnance of the will are going to do. In the end, he didn't have the absolute authority to end the whole strike. He does go ahead and do it. And I think that modicum of agency that he does have is really important. It's important to him understanding his own moral responsibility, and that having the category of tragic dilemmas allows us to name that his own experience, or others in their own situation, their own experience of having some kind of agency, so you bear some kind of moral responsibility.
Please join me in thanking Kate for being with us today.